applaud them.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the Labour Lord, Lord Hacking, and to entirely agree with his conclusion, even if I might express it in slightly stronger terms. I rise to make the first Green Group contribution to this committee stage, and I'll be speaking particularly to Amendment 38 in the names of the Labour Lords Rooker and Krebs, to which I attach my name, although I'll also be all of these amendments in this group are closely interrelated in the area of food and farming, and so to a large extent covering all of them. I also want to express my apologies to the Noble Lord, Lord Fox and others who signed Amendment 2, which I'd also signed, but unfortunately other business in the House forced me into the other chamber. But I think it's interesting to draw parallels between the first two groups, which covered issues of employment law and employment rights, and the group that we're looking at now. And I think the noble lady Baroness O'Grady in particular, but many others also, when we were talking about employment rights, focused on the way in which these were rights which had been achieved over decades, resulting from public campaigning, public effort. We often talk about democracy as meaning things that happen here in this chamber, things that happen in elections and votes. But democracy, at its very heart, is people campaigning. And that's how we've delivered very many of both the employment rights and the rights, the protections for food and against pesticides, as the noble lady Baroness Young of Old Scone very clearly brought out. Those protections haven't been arrived at by a whole lot of people sitting in a chamber. They've come through huge amounts of campaigns from the outside. Now, I think I've actually, like the noble Lord, Lord Hacking, have listened to nearly all of the debate thus far. And I think we've heard, particularly in the early stages, from the noble Lord Minister in particular, trust the intentions of this government. But I do have to contrast that with some of the words we've just heard from the noble lady Baroness Neville Rolfe, talking about government departments thinking boldly, unnecessary regulatory burdens being removed. Now, if that's the message that's being sent to departments, that would seem to be an indication of the government's intentions, I would have thought. And I think those are intentions which we've heard from all sides of your Lordship's House, but I think perhaps particularly notably in terms of their strength and their horror from the crossbenchers, people who can't be accused of being playing party politics or thinking about elections, but people who are simply horrified by the undemocratic, a word that's been used many times, and indeed, as noble lady Baroness Young said, reckless approach of this bill. Now, particularly picking up the reason why I chose particularly to sign Amendment 38, where I could have signed essentially any of them in this group covering toy, cosmetic, food safety, is particularly looking at the issue of farm antibiotic use, which no one has particularly focused on yet. And I think there's an interesting parallel to be drawn here between antibiotic use and, as we've heard many people discussing, the fact that the financial controls have explicitly been excluded from this bill because this is all being dealt with elsewhere until we're going forward. Well, the issue with antibiotics is we are now coming towards the end of a very important, crucial, and indeed I will acknowledge the government world-leading antibiotics strategy, and that is now going to be go through a process of review. So why not exclude antibiotics, if nothing else, if we're looking to exclude financial sector, exclude antibiotics, given there is a whole process of review built there into the system that's going to look at what's happening with antibiotics. And I think also the noble lady Baroness Young of Old Scone said many of the things I was going to say about pesticides, but I think I would associate myself with all of her remarks. But I think pesticides is an area where it's very evident, and we think about neonicotinoids. The ban on neonicotinoids came about after a huge Europe-wide public campaign, a signature with more than a petition with more than 1 million signatures on it. These are things that have been arrived at by the most pure process of democracy. And I come back to the point about the sunset clause and the timing. And I'm not sure that the government has really considered what we're going to see happening in the months ahead. Because if we look at these areas such as pesticide use, food labelling, food laws, we have in all of these areas a few small handful of companies that dominate their sector, enormous multinational companies with massive lobbying power. And those companies are going to be landing on the minister's doors and lobbying, many of them at least, for deregulation, using all of the financial lobbying power they've got, their muscle, to do that. And if we think about what's happened over the years, is there's been a balance between that kind of commercial lobbying and public campaigning. So ministers are going to see all of that lobbying, all that campaigning. I'd ask the Labor lady, the minister, whether perhaps she thinks that the government could manage to ensure that if there is such meetings, there's an equal balance from campaigning groups, from representatives of the public concerned about food safety, concerned about pesticides, concerned about antibiotics. Will the government be making a balanced opportunity for each side of debate to put their lobbying in if they're going to change or remove these regulations? So, my lords, like many people have said, there are ways in which your lordship's house can make this bill less bad. A no regression clause to say that no change would make protections weaker would be something, although pretty complicated, I suspect. Removing the sunset clause, ensuring that departments have time to actually carefully consider the changes would be another thing. But it's very clear that the best possible outcome would be no bill at all.
Yeah.